Chapter 27, Suspension Systems, Day 1, Video 1, Introduction. A couple things we're going to talk about in this series of videos here for the suspension is talk about the different variations of the suspension systems that we've got. We've got everything from a light duty to a heavy duty suspension systems. We'll cover those, talk about the components, what differentiates and what makes one suspension system beneficial over the other, and kind of break down each of those components as we go through there. We'll talk about leaf and multi-leaf suspensions, and equalizer beam suspension. There's a couple of variations of that. Depending on the use of the truck would dictate which suspension system we use. Rubber spring and torsion bar, so a very heavy-duty suspension. Air spring or airbag suspension, by far the most common and the most popular that we've got now, uses air pressure to provide for the changing loads that are put on that suspension. Then we'll talk about advantages of combining a couple of these different systems, taking the advantage of one system, combining that with the advantage of the other one to make a little bit more of a suspension system that works in different applications. So the suspension system is the connection between the frame and the axles. So all the weight that is supported by the frame, we're going to transfer that weight and that force down through the frame to the axles through the suspension, right? And then axles to the wheels, to the hubs, to the tires, out to the pavement. So all of these different systems are carrying the weight and the load of the truck. And each supports it in some way, but the suspension allows movement between the axles and the frame, whether that be because of additional load put on the truck or bumps that the suspension hits as we're driving down the road. The suspension will allow movement between the two while still holding contact with the tires onto the pavement. So then, whatever weight is put on the frame, supported by the frame, whether it be through a fifth wheel plate or a bed or something like that, or a utility box that's put on it, all of those things are going to be transferred through the suspension. A couple of terms I want to talk about here as we go through related to suspension. Jounce. That happens to be when we have like a bump or a impact happens to the wheels and the tires and transferred through. The suspension's job is to move allow the axle to move when it's hitting that bump or the dip in the road, while still supporting the frame and giving that movement there so that we can have some movement between the axle and the frame and allow the suspension to take that up. A complement to that is a rebound, so that when we have that impact that happens or that movement in suspension, a spring is compressed, and then when that spring now wants to expand back to its original size, that's the rebound. So we'll have the bump or the jounce and then the rebound after that for the spring trying to return to its original position. Talking about oscillation, so we can have these are movements of the suspension driven by something. We could have a tire with a dynamic balance problem that is putting a vibration through the axle and then through the suspension. The suspension system itself expanding and contracting, would cause this oscillation. So it's kind of the rhythmic movement of the suspension. And then sprung weight and unsprung weight. Obviously, sprung weight would be anything that from the tractor that is supported, held up by the suspension. So the payload, the frame, the engine, the transmission, the frame would all be sprung weight. Unsprung weight would be things that are like the wheels, the tires, the axles, and part of the suspension components would be unsprung weight, not supported by the suspension. That will become important when we start talking about some of the loads that are put into the suspension when we hit bumps and this sort of stuff. The unsprung weight will have a big difference in how much that suspension has to react when we hit that bump for the lower the unsprung weight. Talk about some different suspension systems. Very popular leaf spring suspension. Equalizer beam, we've got a couple of variations of that for light duty and heavy duty. We'll talk about the characteristics that make those suitable for the different conditions. Rubber block and torsion bar, so a very heavy suspension, heavy duty suspension. Air spring or airbag air suspension, by far the most popular. It's using air pressure to compensate for changes in load and changes in frame height.